much, CN, our presenting sponsor. And welcome back. Up next, we're moving on to the final panel of the forum, Canada's Connection to the World, BC's Transportation and Supply Chain. Before we begin, we're pleased to remind our viewers that this panel has a live Q&A component in Whova following opening comments. Now I'm delighted to introduce this session's sponsor, the Mining Association of BC, to welcome our moderator and our panel.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Goring, and I'm the President and CEO of the Mining Association of British Columbia. I'm pleased to be coming to you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. The Mining Association is the voice of mining in British Columbia, speaking on behalf of our province's 16 major operating mines and 2 smelters, as well as advanced developing mines, and the more than 35,000 employees our industry supports all across the province. We're very pleased to sponsor the 19th Annual Natural Resource Forum and today's panel, Canada's Connection to the World, BC's Transportation and Supply Chain. The Natural Resource Forum is one of the best events of the year for BC's natural resource sectors, and I look forward to a time when we can all gather together in Prince George. Today's panel discussion on British Columbia's supply chain is an important one to all resource sectors, including mining. BC's mines and smelters rely on the supply chain and transportation networks both to get materials they need to site and also to transport our product from site to markets the world over. Whether it's by road, rail, or the ports of Prince Rupert and Vancouver, the sophisticated transportation network across BC moved more than 12 billion worth of low-carbon metals and minerals to market prior to the pandemic. And behind those numbers, behind every ton of product shipped, are thousands of British Columbians whose know-how and expertise enable ours and other sectors to happen. It's easy to take this for granted, but the severe weather and disruptions we experienced in recent months shines an important light on BC's transportation and supply chain. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to your moderator, Alexa Young, Vice President, Government and Public Affairs for the Council of Forest Industries.
Thank you so much, Michael, and welcome everyone. I'm so pleased to be here today, joining you from the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Now, I recognize we're the last panel of the day and of the forum in the third week of January on what, let's be frank, feels like day 8,072 of the pandemic. And I'm sure many of you are running out of steam, but you have my word and zero pressure to this amazing group of panelists who I'm going to introduce to you shortly. But I assure you, you won't be disappointed for sticking around because, and I ask all of you out there in the audience to think about this, when in our collective recent memory has our transportation and supply chain, our roads, rail, pipelines, and ports been so top of mind? Can you remember a time when how we get products from point A to point B been such a hot topic around the dinner table, on Twitter feeds, and on the nightly news? Because of the pandemic, border closures, worker shortages, climate change, fires, floods, growing protectionism, have you, your friends, your family ever been forced to think so much about what you use each day at home and in your workplaces, and what happens when you can't access those things? Food from the grocery store, gas for your car, toilet paper, lumber and nails for your construction projects, equipment for your mines and mills, and forced to think about what happens to our economy, to our society, when we can't get our products to people and businesses around the world who depend on us. The metals, minerals, energy, and forest products produced right here in BC, the products you've been hearing about all week, that are in demand across the globe, that have a low carbon advantage, that are produced by amazing people, as Michael just mentioned, foresters, mill workers, miners, engineers who care about the planet and are proud of the work they do each day, and that are driving partnerships to keep British Columbians working, revenues for hospitals, schools, and affordable housing flowing. And in the context of today's panels, products destined for customers around the world moving. Minister Fleming just gave you some amazing examples of just that, the power of people coming together. So all that to say, we've got a hell of a lot of ground to cover today, and here to help us unpack all these dynamics, what they mean, and where we go from here are many of the leaders who are at the forefront of doing the work and driving the partnerships I just talked about. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's panel, a colleague and friend who needs no introduction to most, Greg Davies, President and CEO of the Business Council of BC, James Thompson, Vice President, Western Region for CN, Ken Veldman, VP Public Affairs and Sustainability at the Prince Rupert Port Authority, Michael Davies, COO at Trans Mountain Corporation, and last but not least, my friend Ian Anderson, Vice President of Logistics for Teck. Hey everyone. So let's dive in, and a reminder that I need all of your help to make this session great and get the answers to what's on your mind. So please keep those questions coming. But I'm going to get the ball rolling with a question to Greg. Greg, you've got the macro cross-sectoral view on all this. I'd really like you to set the stage for us. In the context of what we've heard over the past 2 days, why is a strong, reliable supply chain critical to our well-being? And as we look to the future, as we look ahead, what from your perspective are going to be the key drivers to unleashing the power of our supply chain to benefit BC and the world?
Well, thanks so much, Alexa. And before I start, I just want to acknowledge that I'm on the Coast Salish territory, and specifically the traditional territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh, and thank them for the opportunity to do business on their traditional lands. I'm going to use some props because it's late in the day, but it makes the point. This rapid test was made in Germany. This book with BC pulp was printed in the United States. My iPhone was made in India with technology and interest from Canada and the United States. This small little aluminum ingot, which are much bigger if you've seen them in person, go into electric vehicles and buses that are made in Asia. And this cedar box is my favorite. It's possible because of forest and mill workers, truckers, train operators, bankers, biologists, ship captains, equipment and tool makers, but it's finished by a world-renowned artist and a member of the Squamish Nation. So it underscores the things that we buy, Alexa, and that the world wants to buy from us in order to keep us safe, feed our families, support our government revenues that enable education, health, social, and community services are all interconnected. And as you said, we saw that in full display through some of the real challenges and crises that we've had over the last couple of months between flooding, forest fires, and other COVID-related challenges. But we're a wealthy nation because of trade and our supply chain expertise and infrastructure. They enable us to choose how we want to live, how we want to protect the environment, and how we fund getting better together. So BC, and for that matter, Canada, prior to contact, were open trading economies, and we continue to thrive on that today. We trade because we need to. So simply put, to your question, our export pay the bills for us to have the quality of life we want, the material we need in our households, the government incomes, the incomes in our families, and the quality of life we enjoy overall. The outflow of things and the services enables us to pay for all of those. And it pays for the things like the PanBio test kits that we don't produce here. So it's that balance of trade back and forth that finances that ability. So just some quick data points to give some context to the expert panels that I'm joining today. First of all, BC's merchandise exports, that's the stuff that the world wants to buy from us. 75% of that comes from natural resources and energy, and the trade enabling infrastructure and services that are represented by the talent that's on this panel today. More importantly, investment matters and the ability to host capital. In 2019, just before COVID took place, BC's economy grew by 2.7%. 2% of that growth came primarily from investments in large export-oriented projects and the supply chain infrastructure. So we talked and heard about a lot of them: Site C, LNG Canada, CGL, Trans Mountain, industrial warehousing and manufacturing buildings, road, port, airports, rail infrastructure, and other investments. In other words, after inflation, we would have had a net negative economy in British Columbia in 2019 if not for the natural resource industries and the investment that they brought. BC commodities, natural resource products, as you alluded to, are half the GHG intensity compared to competing jurisdictions' goods. So if we want to meet Paris targets in Glasgow, we need to make sure that more BC product gets to global markets. And I know we're going to hear from Teck Resources, but the copper from Highland Valley is 50% the GHG intensity, and electric vehicles take 4 times more copper. So it's easy to do the math. If we want to get to net zero, we should have more BC products in the things that we buy. But some of the complexity, federal policy, and provincial policy misalignments and challenges need some urgent attention, as we've heard through the week as well, including how do we come together, as you talked about, particularly around early stage ownership and participation of Indigenous people in the economy and projects, but also come together with a common purpose and the opportunities and act on those as a differentiated home for ESG capital. So 2 points I'll leave you just before I turn it over, Alexa. One is we've got almost the most trade agreements of any nation in the world. So how do we act on them effectively? Because right now we're losing out. BC exports represent just 78% of what they were in 2000 levels compared to other OECD export nations. The rest of those nations are up 120% over that same period of time. So we're dropping while the rest of the world is growing and growing trade. Equally alarming is that Canada overall in that same 20-year period of time has declined more than BC. We're at 65% of 2000 levels. And this trade imbalance over time has massive economic consequences in our ability to afford to buy the things we need, but it also presents some logistics challenges as well. And lastly, Canada, in part due to these things and the complexity and cost of doing business, is seeing a real slowing in our GDP per capita. And why does that matter? GDP per capita means growth in wages and a higher standard of living. It means more revenue for government so that they can support the needs and the services that we expect and demand. And so the great thing about natural resources, supply chains, and the technology that support them is that those are the jobs that are the highest paying in the province. In fact, 31 to 114% higher wages than the industrial average in BC. So it begs the question then for the panel today, why wouldn't we use the secret sauce that you talked about and that Minister Fleming referenced around collaboration with common purpose at speed, bringing communities, people, industry, Indigenous leaders together to act on the basket of opportunities that are before us instead of letting others seize them? And that's really the challenge that we have in front of us, but a massive opportunity as well.
And, I really want to get back to that question of how we overcome challenges to really seize the opportunities in front of us. But first, I'm going to go to James next, because James, Greg's painted an excellent picture of how our supply chain here in BC connects us to the world and why that's important to our economy and well-being. Obviously, moving products by rail is a critical component of that, a critical component that didn't escape the impacts of the pandemic. Can you tell us a little bit about CN's experience? And I want to ask this question, has the pandemic changed the global supply chain forever?
Thanks, Alexa. Appreciate the question. And I'm going to save the answer till the very end of this. But, I'm going to go back to day one of the pandemic. And I believe you said it was 8,072 days in total and counting. So quite the journey back in time. And I think back, to how this started. And it started really with a lot of uncertainty, I think, for everyone, all the supply chain partners, customers, shippers. What is this going to look like? What do volumes look like moving forward? What commodities may be impacted? What commodities might be in demand? What this means for the people that, in my case, operate trains, fix our track, repair our rolling stock? And what might the safety needs of our team be during and being able to operate through this pandemic? The volume question got answered relatively early on with, record-setting really volumes of grain, coal, and potash to move in the early days of the pandemic, and very soft merchandise and petroleum chemicals market due to demand. We've seen a shift in that. We've seen merchandise coming back up. We all know and have heard lots, to your point, about conversations at the dinner table about the challenges with container shipping traffic off the West Coast and a backlog of volume there to move. Specifically, more for our partners in the U.S. region, in Tacoma and Long Beach, but also affecting what we're doing in British Columbia. I think about what we had to face, and I think the best way to put it, Alexa, or to share the story to me of the pandemic was connectedness of our partners, connectedness of the supply chain, connectedness of the communities we operate in. And the example I'd like to use for that is a partnership we made with a company in Edmonton, Alberta, early on in the pandemic. We had struggled to source isopropyl alcohol, and in the early days of the pandemic, the biggest challenge was keeping our employees safe, understanding what we needed to do that, and supplies. And I think everybody will remember the shortage of many goods for doing so that took place early on. And the railroad was affected as well. We weren't able to source our cleaning products, et cetera, through traditional means. We reached out to one of our customers who did have a ability to produce isopropyl alcohol, and we're able to get them to assist in getting isopropyl alcohol wapes made for our crews so that we could continue on serving customers right across the country. It's one example of how teams came together to solve a problem. Had that customer not stepped up and helped the railroad, it would have been challenging for the railroad to provide cars as we move forward from that date. And likewise, other customers would have been impacted as well. So, those key partnerships and those key opportunities as we move along are really the success story to me of what took place during this pandemic, of people coming together and teams really supporting one another. Communities, the same story. You look at the challenges that were highlighted through the floods, through the fires this summer. Coming together in those communities to support one another, assisting with, mobilizing, in our case, a via train to evacuate people from Hope, supporting one another and making sure everyone was safe was really the first mission in this. The second mission was understanding what the future may look like for our supply chains and for our customers. And, Alexa, I think I'd be foolish to say I have a full picture of what that looks like going forward, because I don't know that we're necessarily all the way through and out the other side of this, that today is going to be the norm going forward. We may be changing tomorrow again. So to answer the question, has the pandemic really fundamentally shifted or changed the future of the supply chain? I think it really has. But I don't know that there's certainty in what that looks like. I think what it has done is it's changed the supply chain and the supply chain players to be nimbler, to come together more often, to be more connected and more understanding of each other's challenges and trials through the pandemic and really in business overall, because the way we've been successful, and I think this speaks for many on the panel, is being connected to the markets we operate in, the communities we operate in, and the folks we do business with day in and day out, and having conversations and truly understanding what's important and what each other needs to be successful moving forward. Thanks, Alexa, for the question.
Thanks, James. Yeah, no, thanks for that. And what really jumps out at me from that is the fact that in many cases, it's really forced us to think differently and accelerate how we do things and how we innovate to solve some of these challenges. And I do want to get back to that later. But I'm going to turn to Ken, because James has just described the very complex dynamics all of us are facing in getting products to market these days. And in the throes of all these challenges, the Port of Prince Rupert is currently working on an expansion project that's going to see capacity to export containers quadrupled. And anyone who's been in the infrastructure business knows these types of big projects take tons of capitals, years to permit, and boots on the ground building relationships with communities. That's why stability and certainty, both at home and in our key markets, is super critical. So given we're living in these continued uncertain times, how are you and your partners setting yourselves up for success?
Well, thanks for that lead in, Alexa, and certainly greetings from the traditional territory of the Tsimshian people, more recently known as Prince Rupert. And you're right, we really do live in uncertain times, and we're focused on trying to create certainty by simply leaning into what we do well. And to be clear, when I say we, there's a veritable orchestra of women and men from a variety of organizations that make up a port and a gateway and a trade corridor that are a part of this, and those relationships are absolutely critical to what we have done and what we'll continue to do, and to James' point, even more so given the last couple of years. But we've added a lot of terminal capacity, new cargo services, and diversification over the last decade, and our current development portfolio really promises even more. We're a unique North American gateway in that we're not in a big city. In terms of, we've got a population of 15,000 people here. Our cargo per capita is probably the highest in the world. But we focus on what we can do in that environment that ports in a metropolis can't, which is usually based on substituting simple for complex, being able to avoid community and land use conflicts, eliminating congestion with effective long-term infrastructure planning, and as a result, reducing transit time and cost to shippers. Frankly, we've made a name for ourselves as a supply chain innovator, and we're set up well to continue remaking what supply chains look like. The Port of Prince Rupert currently has a container terminal expansion underway, as well as related road and rail infrastructure, all under construction as we speak. That new container capacity is coming on stream in June of 2022, this year, with more expansion to come. We focus a lot on terminals, but there's a surrounding ecosystem and environment that's just as important. We have new import and export logistics operations in advanced stages of commercial and environmental review that are going to dramatically increase options and competitiveness for shippers in a variety of industries, including agriculture, forestry, petrochemicals, and expect final decisions to be made on those in the coming months. We're continuing to expand our bulk export capabilities, especially in the liquid bulk and alternative energy space. We've had 2 new propane export terminals come online in the last couple of years, with final investment decisions imminent on a new terminal capable of handling multiple liquids. In total, we have about $2.5 billion of investment either under construction or very close to it. And we're developing it all in an integrated manner that really eliminates additional costs, bottlenecks, and land conflicts. I couldn't agree more with the comments that we've heard already today. And Prince Rupert specifically is going to be essential to BC and Canada's trade agenda, simply because we've got a track record, the ability and attributes to add to the capacity and innovation that Canadian trade is going to need. And I would argue is needed well before what we've seen happen this year, but it's certainly been punctuated by this year to improve our supply chain resiliency. A sustainable approach to planning and development has ensured that we're minimizing ecosystem impact, establishing new benchmarks for GHG emissions, perhaps most importantly to our partners, the Simpson people, entrenching their economic interest in the growth that we've seen and will continue to see. And you're right; these are really big projects that do align with this broader public interest that have been well talked about by Greg in particular. They're being driven primarily by private sector investment, but the public sector recognition of that public interest is important. Regulatory process efficiency, predictability are key ways that government can de-risk and importantly unlock this private sector investment, as is policy certainty, coordination of public investment into public infrastructure as growth occurs in this corridor. Those are all really, really important parts to how do we create certainty in an uncertain time. From a Prince Rupert perspective, we think that we're leaning in the right directions. We've been on this path for multiple years, and as I said, it's really been validated, I think, by some of the issues that have really been exacerbated in this pandemic time. And we're continuing to double down and move forward with it. And I think that's going to be a benefit to all of BC, its natural resource industries, and all of Canada generally.
Thanks, Ken. And I'm going to turn to Michael because I really want to run with this theme of coming together in difficult times. The recent extreme weather events and floods shut down pipelines and destroyed highways. And Minister Fleming, again, gave us some remarkable examples a while ago of the power of partnership, people coming together to support communities and get infrastructure back up and running. I want to ask you, Michael, can you give us a little bit of a view into how TMX and partners came together during the floods? And importantly, have the floods and the recent supply chain events of the past few months and the last couple of years changed our collective thinking about the transportation of essential goods?
Yeah, thanks, Alexa. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to speak to that. It was certainly a extremely challenging time for us, as it was for many of the folks that were affected by the floods. I'm here today in Calgary, the southern Alberta Treaty 7 lands, and part of the Region 3 for the Métis in Alberta. But I grew up in the Lower Mainland, and a lot of family still there, and follow very closely the effect on the communities there beyond just our own efforts to get the pipeline started again. As you'll know, Trans Mountain is the largest single source of motor fuel supply to the Pacific Northwest. Most of the gasoline that comes to your car for the people that are participating here from BC has come through our pipeline. So for us to have been shut down for 21 days in November and into early December was a significant effect for the local economy. We've never in our history of over 70 years been shut down for more than about 5 days. And so it was an unprecedented time for us here in the company as well too, to overcome that. The effect of the floods is primarily in the Coquihalla and the Coldwater areas where we saw that significant flows, rivers jumping their banks and flowing over the pipeline, erosion of protections we had in the pipeline. But we didn't have any significant damage to the pipe, and that's really important. The challenge that we had was we shut the pipeline down in advance as we saw the storm growing and the potential for geotechnical instability. And the hard part is getting it started again. We need to ensure that the system is safe before we can start it up again. And the challenge over those 21 days was gaining access again to the affected areas. So as you know, the highway was lost, but we had rivers flowing over top of the pipeline. We had weather that prohibited us from getting in the air, those sorts of things. So, pleased, in part because of the work that we've done to prepare in terms of emergency management and ongoing maintenance, not just of the pipe, but of the geohazard that surround it. We have programs where we spend millions of dollars annually on both of those things to make sure the system is safe. So those things, worked for us. Pleased about that. And the other thing that we were very fortunate with was the resources that we had in the region because of our expansion project and our own operations. We have people and equipment distributed along the pipeline system. But as you know, significant workforce in BC, upwards of probably close to 10,000 people working on the expansion project. So with those resources in hand, we were able not to address our own needs in terms of building pioneering roads back into establish access to the upper reaches of the Coquihalla. We built a bridge over the Coldwater River that was helpful in terms of getting access to our system, but also reopening of the Coquihalla. We were able to redirect rivers back into their normal channels so that we could get access to the pipe and assess it and make some minor repairs. On top of that, as the minister alluded to, Mr. Fleming alluded to, we were able to assist the highways with getting Highway 5 and parts of Highway 1 open again with that equipment. And we were also able to help some of the communities as well too. So, for example, the Barrowtown pump station, anyone that followed that saga in the Sumas Prairie, threatened by floods, our contractors who were located in Hope were able to go there with some of their equipment and help the sandbagging crews. We were able to provide food and shelter to communities that had been evacuated. So some good efforts beyond just our own system as well too. And during that period, the other thing, and there's an op-ed that's out in the Globe and Mail, I think it is today, which was kind of pointing to the other story that was going on. It's not broadly known, but we were also quite front and center in conversations with our regulators, both federal and provincial, with responsibility for fuel supply into the region, and working with them and our shippers to coordinate and get through this period with supply interruption. As you know, that resulted in rationing of fuel, and very pleased to see there was good behavior from the markets there. There was no run on fuel. There was no significant uptick in demand. And we were able to work together with regulators to make sure that there was interim kind of stopgap cargoes that were brought in by Marine that kind of got us through that period. As I mentioned in the beginning, I grew up in the Lower Mainland, and I've watched the growth in the community there, of businesses and housing, and over the years, significant changes since I was a kid. And one of the strong takeaways from this event is infrastructure resilience. And in contrast to all that growth of businesses and the population in general, we're still supplying that region with the same 24-inch mainly pipeline that comes from Alberta and supplies the same fueling infrastructure, the same terminals that were essentially built back in the 50s. So One of the things as we look forward, and it's often overlooked, our expansion project is known as many as a market access project. It very much is. But another important aspect of it that I think the floods have brought to the fore is the resiliency of infrastructure. And so it will provide us with a second pipeline in a similar corridor, but a second pipeline that will help provide supply resilience going forward to that key resource, which is motor fuel. That's our mission. And I guess the last thing I just mentioned as well too is in terms of resilience, one of the things that we're doing with our project is creating meaningful participation opportunities with local and Indigenous communities, and that brings resilience in an important way. Is one of the many things that we've done beyond just building up experience for workers. We've got 2,000 Indigenous workers working on the project today, $2.5 billion of business opportunities for Indigenous communities across the project, 55 different communities across the project. Key amongst that is developing some substantial energy service contractors. And in BC, there's a real absence of that, particularly in the region that we operate in. There's a lot up in northeastern BC, but in the southern part of the province, less so. And so one of the many enduring legacies for the project in this space will be a number of sophisticated, competitive energy service contractors with a strong safety culture that matches our own. And they'll be available to help with us in these sorts of events. You know, we may not have a major project underway in the future, but we will have these other contractors and some of the legacy from the project there to help us as well too. So I think, Alexei, that's kind of my experience with it. It was a very demanding time for us over that time. I was happy to have the break over Christmas, and we are back at full capacity now. We did that about a week or so ago, and we'll be continuing to work in that area to secure the system and ensure the rivers and the pipeline is safe and things back where they should be. But it's been a challenging time, and thank you for the question.
Thanks, Michael, and certainly lots to be proud of in terms of how your team came together and pulled through for British Columbia during that difficult time. I want to double down on your other theme of building resilience. And before I turn it to Ian, I just want to remind people to get your questions into Huba, because I'm going to turn to that here shortly. But Ian, you bring a really interesting perspective, because Teck is both a rail and port user and also a part owner of Neptune Terminals. So you really bring both hats to the table in this discussion. And I want to circle back again to the events of the past couple of years. And calls for climate action have really intensified during the pandemic, and last year's wildfires and floods certainly intensified that important conversation about how we both reduce emissions, but also make infrastructure more resilient to the impacts of climate change. And Teck's really been a leader in this regard. Your CEO, Don Lindsay, others have noted this week, has called for an industrial policy to support the transition to a low carbon economy. How are supply chain users like Teck working with their rail, port, and other partners to address growing expectations in this regard? And what are we seeing around the world?
Thank you for your question, Alexa. It's a great one. And just before I start, in the spirit of reconciliation, I did want to acknowledge that I come to you today from Treaty 7, the traditional and ancestral territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Kainai, Piikani, Siksika, Tsuut'ina, and Stoney Nakoda, as well as Métis Nation Region 3. And so for those who don't know us, Teck is one of Canada's leading mining companies. We have operations and projects in Canada, the United States, Chile, and Peru. And it's our view that climate change is clearly accelerating and that it is having significant impacts around the planet. And that's not new news, but I think it's poignant to understand the economic devastation that flows from those events, often in the many billions of dollars. And some, like McKinsey did in 2020, are suggesting that climate change is in fact the weakest link in global supply chains. And of course, we really did see those impacts firsthand in British Columbia this past year. And both as the minister did, and we have earlier in the session, I do want to acknowledge the extreme conditions and the hard work and the ability to get the job done safely that everybody who was involved in the restoration efforts that have occurred since the floodings. And so when you look at that history in 2021, we had first an unprecedented heat wave, then the wildfires that caused both enormous damage and displacement for so many. That was followed not long after by the rains and the flooding, and that cost billions, and it caused damage that will take years to fully repair. And then the one that people are also forgetting is right after that, we were followed by all-time record cold temperatures, and that yet again caused enormous disruption and damage. So that's a chaotic backdrop. And I'll break down my response to your question into both international and domestic activity. So let's start internationally with export shipping. The majority of Teck's customers are overseas. Our product travels by rail, by truck, and by pipeline from mines to terminals at coasts. And there they're loaded onto bulk export vessels. And in maritime shipping, emissions reduction is a big topic, maybe the biggest topic, and equally a big challenge. They are significant emitters. And so on the world stage, the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, has set 3 distinct targets. First of all, to decrease carbon intensity in new ships, and that's through energy efficient design, or EEDI. Second, to decrease CO2 emissions in international shipping by at least 40% by 2030. And finally, to decrease GHG emissions in international shipping by at least 50% by 2050. And this has started really a race, right? There's great uncertainty about which technology will be successful in powering the next generation of ocean-going vessels. And there's a range of suitors from LNG, which is an early frontrunner, to ammonia, methanol, and biodiesel. And at the same time, innovation is occurring in new ships around hull design, propellers, and cogeneration even, such as Flettner rotors, which utilize wind to supplement diesel-electric engines. And this is such a significant problem that new build ships are in fact scarce. Owners are hesitant to bet on what will be the winning next generation fuel. And so last year, Teck engaged in an industry-leading agreement with large bulk ship owner Oldendorf. And we based our commercial agreement primarily on emissions reductions. We use large eco-friendly new build vessels, we slow steam them, and this creates emissions reductions in the range of 30 to 40% for these shipments. And so based on those savings, we think it's about 45,000 tons of CO2 each year, or equivalent to removing about 10,000 passenger vehicles from the road. Let's just turn then to the domestic front. So as Barack Obama said, the world needs more Canada. They need more of our low emissions natural resource products. And so at home, Teck is involved in a range of exciting low emissions activities. It's transportation solutions such as electric buses for transportation of mine workers, electric concentrate trucks, and a first of its kind portable EV charging location in SEBC or southeastern BC. And we're also very excited about the work that the railways are doing on alternate fuel locomotives. And our ports like Neptune are in a unique emissions position versus their global peers because their power is supplied by hydroelectricity. And in fact, as Greg has noted, the 2019 report for the BC Business Council showed that BC's energy and commodity exports are about half the carbon content of those of their global competitors. And I do want to just turn, as I finish, back to the point that you mentioned about Don's speech on Monday and what this means on a national level conversation or stage. So this Monday, Don was the chair of the Business Council and also Teck CEO, made a presentation to the Canadian Club, and it was followed by this op-ed piece in the Financial Post. And he was calling really for 4 things, 2 of which were first, a clean industrial strategy in the country, and then for transformational investments. And that means federal and provincial investments in green infrastructure. And that's really to build on Canada's clean resource advantage. And so that's investments in electrification, carbon capture utilization and storage, decarbonizing technologies. In other words, nation-building projects. And those are not unlike when we built the transcontinental railroads. But these will be the ones that power the supply chains of the future. And so it's exciting to see that call for action, to see concrete steps. And clearly those can't come soon enough when we look at the resiliency of our transportation supply chains. So I'll stop there and we can go to the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks. And I'd like to, I really want to, talk about this innovation space because I can't help but think about all the tech tools, resources, and talent that are going to be required to see some of these opportunities to have a competitive edge on the global stage to address some of the big issues that all of our industries and the world are facing around things like climate change and beyond. So let's talk about that. And I want to hear from you, from the innovation in the supply chain perspective. What's the new big thing, and what are your companies doing? And as part of that, I want you to think about the question that we currently have on Huva. Do you expect that we may soon see blockchain being used to enhance security, traceability, and proof of origin in BC logistics? So someone can take that one if they feel like it, but I'll open it up to whoever wants to go first.
I can go first, actually, if you want, Alexa. We just made an announcement today about the use of blockchain technology in terms of tracing germanium from the Red Dog mine in Alaska through to our customers. And we feel this is a great step in that first step in traceability and being able to show end to end from where production occurs right to utilization.
If I could, Alexa, I'd like to jump in on that too with what Ian was saying about traceability. I mean, the railroad being a large entity, I've got in our entire company, we've got somewhere in the tune of 130,000 rail cars on our network, a couple thousand locomotives that we track around. And I do see the blockchain being something that in the future we'll be able to leverage for tracking, tracing, inventory management, all of those things. I think you likely many saw it in the news a few weeks ago about CN's partnership with Google Cloud and some technology there as well. So all points to the future do point to a digitized future, digital scheduled railroading, if you will. And I think the blockchain becomes a part of that for sure.
Thanks, James. Greg, I know you wanted to jump in there.
Well, I was going to say, as Canadians, we're always really good about saying we're great at everything. We're not. But we're really good at a lot of it. Infrastructure, engineering, natural resource extraction, and certain elements of technology. In fact, on quantum, we're one of the top 5 places in the world. AI and machine learning applications, visualization using augmented reality and digital twins. Those are all the tools for James and Ian and Michael and Ken to think about how they reduce emissions, how they predictively model what they can do, and how they can build and grow their opportunity for customers, but also how they can drive an innovative low carbon economy that attracts over $100 trillion of ESG capital. So I'll give you one small example that Ian talked about. There's been some work done on this, but we've got all these trade agreements with some of the biggest nations in the world. Could we go out to ports and jurisdictions that we trade with in the Asia Pacific through CPTPP and other jurisdictions and create ports of the future? So back to Ian's point around the nervousness around being a first mover on capital, let's become a hydrogen and LNG and alternative energy supplier with Busan, with Tianjin, with other markets around the Northwest and Pacific Rim. Start to drive some of the technology on traceability that James just talked about. NFTs, one of the biggest NFT companies, which is really a verification blockchain company, is in Vancouver, $5 billion business that didn't exist 5 years ago. So how do we start to collaborate at speed with common purpose? Because the rest of the world's competing on exactly the same things that we're talking about. And we're either going to be the retail buyers of that technology and those applications, or we could be the creators that create the pathway for new jobs, indigenous ownership of that technology and some of those opportunities as partners in new projects. There's a massive opportunity, but opportunity takes action and it takes execution. So when I got the call probably after Michael did, because what are we going to do on fuel rationing at 6 o'clock in the morning when the flooding started? My grandfather was the flood warden in Abbotsford in 1949 as a volunteer. They didn't move as quickly as Michael and everyone else did. And it's remarkable that we rebuilt our trade infrastructure in the span of 2 months. In many jurisdictions, that's going to take years to do. But why? People had a common purpose. They had urgency to get it done, and they didn't let all the nonsense get in the way. They worked together to make sure it happened. People got protected. Generally, people got looked after. But we were back up and running again and didn't miss a beat. And we'll forget about the supply chain stuff in another few months. But we can't, because that's a great example of what we could do on reducing climate, creating wealth, creating participation in the economy, and driving innovation, which is a horizontal. It's not a sector. It's actually every business in BC is driving technology.
If I could
Any
just
other
add to that,
takers?
Alexa.
Michael,
Yeah, Alexa, if I could just add to it as well, on our system in terms of tech innovation, and there's other things we're doing that are innovative, including market access for Canada. But for tech, one of the things we've chosen to deal with our pipeline is we built a conduit along with the pipe, and that conduit will give us a fiber backbone, which not particularly cutting edge in terms of communication, but it will be a dedicated system for the pipeline, which brings cybersecurity. It brings far deeper control and efficiency of operating the system. And we're also looking at some Canadian developed technology that uses specialized fiber that will give us much better sensing along the whole pipeline, not just at particular nodes and stations, but a much deeper awareness of activity all along the pipeline route. And that fiber backbone will be working with partners to provide better access. So there's parts of our system in North Thompson where there is very poor internet availability. This will help provide access from communities as well too.
Thanks, Michael. I'm conscious of time, and I really want to answer this question that's up on Whova, because I think it really speaks to the opportunity, some of the challenges, and how we work together to get to the other side and really seize what BC can be. And it's what action or support from other stakeholders, so government, communities, is needed in order to implement the suggestions that the panel has talked about today. And I would put industry in there as well. I mean, it's, as we all talked about, it's a collective effort. And when you strip it all down, you can often see that we have far more in common than not. And so in our final 7 or so minutes, I'd like to go around the group and just ask you, in less than a minute and a half, what do you see as being the key to seizing the opportunity in front of us from a partnership perspective? Greg,
I can start if
you.
Michael.
Okay.
One of the key things that I've seen in our space, I think, is just around creating opportunities for meaningful participation for Indigenous communities around reconciliation. So finding opportunities for those communities to participate in infrastructure. I think a recognition of infrastructure resilience is important. And also as part of this, and there was also a question up there about geopolitical, is market diversity. And that's one of the main underpinnings of the work that we're doing. Canada's got some of the largest resources in the world, but we can only take our oil and gas to the United States. And so our project and our expansion is going to provide diversity of markets and market access that will help create wealth for Canadians. And I think it's important to recognize that as we move forward.
Thanks, Michael. Greg, lightning round. You're up.
I think building on Michael, I'm just going to make a point. We live in an era of what I call collaborative democracy. No one has the credibility or the capacity anymore to make decisions in and of themselves. And so there's some questions around things that we shouldn't have done or should do going forward. But the systems we put into place over the last 30 years in Canada have made us, because we've had wealth, we've become lazy. So the processes around why we shouldn't do things as opposed to how we can do them. And I think that we need platforms, and the Natural Resource Forum is a great example. We're bringing people together to say, look, what are our common values? What do we agree on? And how do we move forward together? Yes, we're going to disagree on some things, but let's figure out what it is and how we can solve to them. And it's a different focus than Canada, I would argue, has had for the last 20 years. The second part of it is, and Michael talked about this, is how do we create those spaces for meaningful participation? Early stage ownership for First Nations in projects before permitting. How do we finance that? How do we, Ken's doing some great work, and Rupert, around building those relationships where there's true and full meaningful participation, as there are others on this space. But we've got to get over ourselves. We're a small open trading economy that nobody thinks about. And the reality is, if we don't start looking after our own self-interest, others are going to do it for us and are doing it for us. And so I think there's risk among all, people would die and do die for the kinds of quality of opportunity we have in Canada. So we've got an obligation to actually act on it in the best interest of the world, but also our own citizens.
Great call to action, Greg. Ian, what would you like to leave the audience with?
I will stick with the climate change theme because it's just so important. And when you look at our international customers, be that copper smelters, copper producers, steelmaking producers, they are just crying out for reductions in emissions opportunities. And they would like nothing more than to partner with Teck and with British Columbia and with our natural resource industry in green corridors. And those corridors can stretch from the coast of British Columbia through to Japan and Korea and to China. And they would like nothing more than to see vessels or clean transportation networks powered by the fuels of the future. And what that takes is, I think there's an opportunity for First Nations around reconciliation to participate in building that distribution network. There's opportunity for private companies to engage in that. And finally, there's the requirement for federal and provincial investment in those new distribution networks. That is the future of where we're going, but we need to galvanize and guide behind that.
Thanks, Ian. Ken.
Let me build on that even. Let me build on that even further. There's no doubt that North America is going to continue to be a key supplier and a key market globally. But how well Canada and BC can actually do within that potential is going to be relying on having supply chains that competitively make these global linkage, right? How do supply chains have to add value, not just be a way to get there? And so if you think of BC as a gateway, not just for BC and not even just for Canada, but for North America, and to be successful in achieving that goal, the new investment, the innovation, the scale that's going to be required to get there in a net zero world, that's going to benefit all of us, BC exporters in particular, and the BC economy first and foremost. But it's going to take this coordinated and collaborative effort to get there. Private sector, public sector, communities to achieve that. And the community piece is really important. Communities, especially Indigenous communities and whose land and territory we're looking to develop these supply chains in, need to be able to see a better future because of development. And that's where this collaboration is going to have to get to. It can't just be a matter of collaborating and coordinating investments into it, but ensuring that we've got this bigger picture of how do we ensure that those pieces around the edge, that's what we're actually de-risking from this process. So to Greg's point, we are finding ways to get there as opposed to finding ways to not get there. And that starts with creating this vision of making sure that everybody sees the benefit in that going forward.
A great point. James, final thoughts on how we seize the opportunity in front of us?
To me, it's really about collaboration, Alexa. It's about partnerships with, each other within the supply chain, but as I highlighted, in the local communities and, specifically the First Nation communities along the corridor we operate in, and learnings we can take away from those folks. As Ian highlighted, the resiliency we need with climate change on the horizon, or the challenges we face with climate change presently, and we've seen this year. I'm going to anecdotally talk about our restoration at Jackass Mountain. Minister Fleming brought forward the challenge the highway had there. We had an equal challenge down below the highway as our railroad tracks were in essentially the same predicament. And our challenge at that point in time in restoration was managing the water. There was still an immense amount of water coming off the mountains. How do we handle this water and try to rebuild the railroad? Much the same challenge the highways faced. I was in a gas station in Boston Bar and met a gentleman there I'd met during the summer, during the fires when we were also out in the area. And he made a suggestion to me. He says, the water used to flow off that mountain to the east. If you took the water to the east, you might have an easier time managing it than trying to go to the west like you guys are. We went to the east and we managed the water. That's the final thought I'll leave on that topic. I mean, I didn't know that. Nobody on site knew that. Gentlemen that had been there for 50 years knew it. We need to leverage that know-how. We need to leverage that knowledge, and we need to build those bridges. That's what I would say is the key to our success going forward.
Thanks, James, and thanks everyone. This was a great discussion, powerful perspectives from a great group of leaders on working together, getting out of our own way, seizing the new tech and tools that are allowing us to do things better, safer, and more sustainably. So thanks for joining us, everyone, today. Thanks for your great questions. Stay safe, stay healthy, and keep doing what you're all doing to try to make BC and the world a better place. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. We greatly appreciate your participation in the 19th Annual BC Natural Resources Forum. It's been an extremely enlightening and eventful 3 days. Now, on behalf of the conference organizers, the Forum Advisory Committee, sponsors, exhibitors, and speakers, I would like to thank you all for tuning in. I'd like to thank my team for their hard work, agility, and perseverance in the delivery of another virtual forum, including Melissa McRitchie, Claire Perouse, Nicole Vanderfleet, Tom Fannin, and Heidi Martel. We'd also like to give out a shout out to our amazing production teams, Blake Productions in Prince George and Oh Boy Productions in Vancouver. Thank you to everyone that helped and supported this year's event. And I would once again like to thank you for attending the 2022 BC Natural Resources Forum and officially bring this year's forum to a close. We are really looking forward to seeing you next year in person in Prince George.